Katara becomes a more complicated character as she indulges in her dark side, and everyone else pays the price. This is Avatar Explained for episode 109, The Waterbending Scroll. Part 1, Synopsis. After the events of episode 108, Avatar Roku, the group feels a necessity to teach Aang the other three elements, especially waterbending, which is the reason they're going to the North Pole. So the episode starts with Katara teaching Aang waterbending moves, and he gets them very quickly. So quickly that Katara is a bit perturbed. Waterbending has always defined Katara's identity. She was the only waterbender in her entire tribe, and Sokka resoundingly mocked her for her bending, but she always treasured it. She always considered it a link to her culture and a necessary part of her identity. So to see Aang, who is not from the water tribe and who has no background in waterbending, master these techniques so easily and so quickly angers her a little. This in part leads her to steal a waterbending scroll from a group of pirates. She claims that because the pirates stole it, this isn't really stealing. And she starts learning from the scroll. She says she wants to teach Aang, but in reality she wants at least as much to teach herself and to improve her own skills. And eventually she gets so fed up with Aang's natural talent that she practices during the night by the river where they can be seen. And sure enough, she is seen, and this puts the entire group in danger. They're chased both by Zuko and by a group of pirates. A bunch of machinations go on where the pirates and Zuko are on the same side, but they also have opposing interests, and they're both jockeying for position. And Team Avatar sees the strategic value in pitting them against each other, and this works to a certain extent, but they still need to fight their way out of the situation and eventually stop themselves from going over a waterfall. In the end, Aang and Katara team up and use their waterbending prowess to save the lives of everyone in the group, until Appa can come along and listen to the call of the bison whistle Aang bought and save them all. Therefore, the conflict is resolved somewhat. Yes, there's this dichotomy between Aang, who's naturally talented, and Katara, who is not quite as naturally talented, but she has more grit and determination. And we will see that continue throughout this show. But this feud that's simmered throughout this episode, most of it one-sided, with Katara feeling so jealous, is mostly ended here. Part 2. Analysis. This is one of the better episodes of the first season of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I appreciate how passionately and how in-depth it's willing to dive into Katara's dark side. Of course, it doesn't explore that dark side as deeply as it will later, but it's still a nice moment. Katara up to this point has mostly been portrayed as a one-dimensionally morally good person, and as someone who's a lot less flawed than, say, Aang, who's very childish, and Sokka, who's very meat-headed. But this episode really demonstrates that she has her own flaws and her own demons that she will have to overcome. Admittedly, she doesn't do anything terribly wrong here. Sure, she gets too jealous, and she ends up costing the group a lot and putting them in danger, but she doesn't do anything that causes permanent damage. Still, I do appreciate the shift in how she's characterized. When Aang is trying to say, "Oh no, it's not your fault, Katara," Iroh bluntly says, yeah, it actually kind of is your fault. That's what I love about Iroh. He's a very wise and caring and kind mentor, but he's not afraid to dish out some very blunt and brutally honest advice if he thinks that's what would help someone best. There are actually a few great Iroh moments here. One of my favorite is when he sees Zuko fighting with the leader of the pirates, and he says something to the extent of, "Can't you see that while you're fighting, your ship has set sail?" And Zuko thinks he's just making an expression, but Iroh points out that he's being very literal, and their boats are floating down the river. And so they go off to correct that, and Iroh thinks to himself, maybe it should be an expression. But the real star of this episode is Katara. I love how nuanced its portrayal of her guilt and her jealousy is. She is a good person fundamentally. She's flawed, but she realizes that what she's doing is wrong. She apologizes for being so jealous of Aang's natural talent. But then right after that, she takes the waterbending scroll anyway and goes to the river, showing how deep that drive within her is to be a great waterbender, a better waterbender than Aang, someone who only has natural talent. It really reveals that the show is willing to analyze and criticize its characters when it needs to. That nuance is enough to elevate even lesser episodes and make them not only worth watching, but genuinely heartfelt and emotive. And for an episode with a better premise and a better written conflict like this, that level of nuance can produce something genuinely great and genuinely affecting. And I do think about this episode a lot. Of course, at the end, there's the phony moral that stealing is wrong, except if it's from pirates, which is a parody of the old, very message-driven kid shows of the 90s. But there is a real message hidden beneath that phony moral. That message being that if one lets themselves be consumed by jealousy, they might hurt themselves and those around them. I appreciate how it forces Katara to really earn her goodness. A lot of fundamentally good characters in shows like this are portrayed as angels. They're saint-like, they're flawless, they can do nothing wrong. Katara is much more compelling because she is flawed. She does err sometimes. And that's not presented as entirely negative, it's presented as natural. Of course she messes up, she's only human. She's not perfect, she's not a god, and what makes her truly admirable is how she's willing to face that darkness, face those flaws, and fight through them. That's how she becomes a good person. It's not just something that's naturally bestowed upon her, it's something she has to earn, it's something she has to work for. And I really appreciate that, and I find it very relatable. Part 3. Context. This is the first time Zuko and Katara meet, which sounds strange that this only happens in the 9th episode of the show, considering how integral their relationship becomes to the show. She starts off as very antagonistic toward him, then they become much closer when they're stuck in prison together in Ba Sing Se. They have a very sweet and profound and intimate moment. And then, in the same episode, Zuko betrays Katara and joins Azula, rejecting his entire character arc, and this really hurts Katara on a personal level. She acts like it's not as personal as it is, but it is incredibly personal. She gave herself to this guy, she trusted him absolutely, and he stabbed her in the back. This has consequences. When Zuko tries to join the group in Season 3, Katara is the last one to accept him. And when Zuko calls her on this, when he's like, "Why don't you trust me?" she responds, "I was the first one to trust you." She has a very big heart, but when someone does her wrong, she does hold it against them. She doesn't want to be hurt like that again. She hates being betrayed, and not just in the same way that most people do. She hates it in a very deep and primal and fundamental way that drives her. But eventually she overcomes her feelings of hurt and betrayal and is able to accept Zuko. And it's a very beautiful moment because it's earned, because it's honest, because it's not easy. Zuko has to do a lot to get there. As of this episode, they don't have anything nearly that complex. He's basically taunting her and threatening her and showing he has her mother's necklace to try and persuade her to bend to his will, and she won't. She stands firm. And he's very creepy and very sinister. He's like, "I'll save you from the pirates, Katara." It's not the best way to start what becomes a much more thoughtful and nuanced relationship, but I kind of like that, actually. I like that starts from such a antagonistic place and gradually builds into something very supportive and mutual. I think it's a beautifully constructed relationship all around, and it is important to note that starts right here. Even aside from Katara's relationship with Zuko and Katara's dark side being introduced as a whole, this episode is surprisingly influential. It is an important part of the foundation of Avatar: The Last Airbender. A lot of characters and events introduced here have lasting effects later on, even by the standards of this show. It's impressive. The pirates return, though that's probably the least notable return. They help try to kill Zuko, but they fail, and Zuko boards Zhao's ship with Iroh and tries and eventually succeeds at capturing the Avatar before he's doomed by a blizzard. More interestingly, the White Lotus is introduced here, this secret society that will become very important throughout the course of Avatar: The Last Airbender. But here it's just, oh, Uncle Iroh lost his White Lotus tile. It's tempting to think that this won't be consequential. I kind of thought that the first time I watched this series, even though I did have some prior knowledge of the White Lotus. But no, him losing that tile is not just an excuse for a silly plot. It's an indication of how important that tile is, how integral it is to Iroh's identity and what he is involved with. Zuko, of course, doesn't see this any more than the audience does, so he's frustrated and annoyed, but viewed in the context of the whole show, it's an important moment in Iroh's story because it introduces one of the most important parts of his character, something that will continue to shape Iroh's storylines going forward. And of course, there's the most obvious and immediately consequential thing introduced in this episode, which is the conflict between Aang and Katara over who's going to be the best waterbender long term. And while it's not antagonistic going forward, it still is a conflict. Katara eventually becomes much better than Aang because she trains while Aang doesn't. Pakku, despite his initial sexist reluctance, accepts her and appreciates her as a waterbender, and says that she will do a great job training Aang, which she does throughout the course of Season 2. Aang becomes a much better waterbender because Katara is there to teach him and to guide him. So not only does she become better, she becomes better enough that she's there to facilitate his journey as a waterbender going forward. It's a really satisfying and cathartic moment, and really shows how committed Katara can be at her best. What I love about Katara is how closely her light and dark sides are connected. Yes, her jealousy is bad, but it's very deeply connected to her deep desire for self-improvement, especially in terms of waterbending. That will be a huge net positive for her going forward. So anyway, thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more analyses like this. And overall, thanks for watching. Watch more Avatar. Tune in for the next Avatar Explained video. Adios, comrades.